Welcome everyone, online and in person, to an intergenerational panel on trans survival, on the history and present of trans survival, organized by Pinko Magazine. My name is Greg Newton. I am the co-founder of the Bureau of General Services Queer Division, along with my partner, Dr. Jokum. We have the lovely Hal Lanza volunteering with us. We're an all-volunteer organization. The Bureau, we like to say, is a government agency for a government that does not yet exist. And the service we provide is holding this space for queer culture. So thanks for coming out tonight. We are all volunteer and we do have a suggested donation of $10, but if you're able to, whatever you're able to give, we appreciate. There's change in the bag. And for those of you online, you can Venmo us at BGSQD, just like on the t-shirt. So I'll pass that around. If you're able to give something, great. If not, no worries. And if you're not already on our email list and would like to be, you can sign up for that at the register, and you'll get an email every other Monday about our upcoming events. And we have a lot coming up. So you can also check out the calendar on our website, bgsqt.com. And that's all for me. I'm going to turn it over to Lou from Pinko Magazine, and we're going to jump right in. Yes, thank you.
Is this on? Everybody can hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much to the Bureau for having us. It's really great to have a space like this to gather. And thank you just so much to all of our panelists for convening this evening and for everybody who's here virtually and in person. I think that one of the things that we want to discuss tonight is just how to get more people in the room together, talking and thinking about what's going on and figuring out how to address some of the troubling developments, but also thinking about how we can just be together more and gathering our power together. So I'm just really grateful for everybody who's here and wanting to think about that with us. So before we get into the conversation, I'm just going to have each of our panelists introduce themselves, tell us your name and sort of where you're coming from, what you want that to be your professional position, your anything about your sort of background that you're bringing into the discussion this evening that you think is important for the audience to know. We'll start on my right. That's Cecilia.
Hi everybody. So happy to be here with all of you. My name is Cecilia Gentili. I use gender pronouns she and her, and I identify as a transgender woman. The most important parts of my identity are the fact that I'm trans, that I am an immigrant. I live in this country for about 10 years. I'm documented. I am a sex worker. I am a person in recovery. I understand recovery as my recovery. It's not the recovery of other people. My own recovery is maybe different than other people understand recovery, but it's my recovery. And yeah, that's who I am. I'm a person who was incarcerated because of my sex work profession and the criminalization of drugs. And yeah, and I'm a survivor of all kinds of violence. And that's me. And I'm 50 years old, so I guess I'm an elder.
Hello. Hello. Yeah. My name is Nsambu. That's Suekama translation, blessing in disguise. You can call me Blessing. I am from the Bronx, New York. I'm 25 years old, and I am former co-founder of Rapid Response Organization and also a mutual aid organization that was called Squad. We were inspired by the Street Trans Action Revolutionaries, co-founded by Sylvia Rivera, Marshall P. Johnson, and it's now defunct. It's not an active formation anymore, but we were active in New York City between 2019, 2020, focusing on an anarchist and autonomous approach to trans liberation. Our organization was exclusively Black and non-cis, so we couldn't have any non-Black and cisgender members in the organization. Outside of organizing, I'm an artist, a poet, And I love to go out on water at the Bronx River on boats. That's like one of my favorite pastimes. I hope to do that this weekend actually. I too am a survivor. I am disabled, obviously, so representing my pain here. And those are the things I feel comfortable sharing right now. My pronouns, by the way, are she, her, and they, them.
Yeah, hi, Nikki, Easterday, they them pronouns. I'm an attorney with Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund. I do have to do that really fun little asterisk that everything that I say today is my views and not the views of my employer. I have been spending, I think, the last 10 years really focused on access to gender affirming care, and I approach my work through the critical trans politics lens, and I spent quite a bit of time talking about administrative violence and what that means for trans people broadly, and also as a framework for looking at the ways in which we experience oppression, and I think more importantly, ways in which we can intervene and protect ourselves and our community from that oppression.
Thank you all so much. It occurs to me that I did not really introduce myself. I'm really terrible at remembering to do that. So my name is Cornum. I'm an editor with Pinko Magazine. When we convened this gathering, Pinko is a magazine of gay communism. Some of my other co-editors are here. Maybe they'll ask questions later. So Michelle and Max, and I think Addison's joining us virtually. See there's not that much you need to know about me. I use they them pronouns. I'm Dene or Navajo from Arizona, but I've lived in New York City for since 2007. And I'm just really honored to be speaking with you all today and hearing about your perspectives on, I guess, just what the hell is going on is my first question. I'd love to hear sort of everybody's kind of diagnosis of the kind of current situation, in regards to that's sort of legislation that is targeting trans people, the larger sort of political or social climate that seems to be feeding into that or affected by that. So anybody who wants to start on that question first, but just what are some of the developments to you that seem the most pressing or important right now?
It's a shit show. It's a terrible shit show. I think it is a terrible time. It's a really terrible moment to be trans in this country. I just, in a personal note, my citizenship was denied and was sent to be reviewed. So I'm in a point where I'm like, oh, fuck this country, why do I keep fighting so hard to be part of this country when, like, all the people of my age in Argentina who survived the dictatorship are getting a pension, or a reparations pension for the pain and suffering, right? All my peers are, getting a reparation pension from their suffering, right? And I'm fighting to be in this country that is most likely, penalizing me for being trans, that is like criminalizing my existence. So I'm a little bit upset at the country, so I don't have many good things to say about it. The reality of trans people, especially the reality of trans people in like red states, is like really in a really, really vulnerable position. And I wish I could say that I have faith. I continue to lose faith every day in this country, making it to be who they promised they were.
I'm happy to jump in. So I think we are, particularly this year, seeing an intensification of sort of the ongoing political project that is the United States of America. So we're seeing, I think, an increasing intensification. I think we're seeing somewhat new tactics being deployed, but I do think it's important to conceptualize this and place it in. The United States has always been a settler colonial project. It's always been a project that has been founded on eugenics logic. And so what we're seeing now is really just essentially just an intensification of that. particularly if we're looking at the legal landscape or the legislative landscape, we're losing ground, I think is a fair way to put it. We've lost a lot of ground, we've been pushed, and I'm speaking from a legal perspective, we've been pushed into a defensive posture. I also don't have anything good to say about the United States as a political program, and I also am losing faith. I think that there is a unwarranted optimism when it comes to the power of the legal field to obtain trans liberation, trans equality, that I think there are nuanced ways that we can think about using a legal system, but I think we are, and I feel, given the audience and sort of the panel here, I'm probably not alone in sort of this idea of the law has some severe limitations, and the legal system has some severe limitations. So I think trans liberation cannot be derived from that process. I could speak a little bit more about this, but I certainly don't want to monopolize sort of talking about this current trend.
I think I'm next. For me, I have not had faith in America since Michael Brown was killed. 2014, I was in high school at the time. That really activated me. I already sort of had, certain, I guess you could say, left-leaning ideological interests, but it was around that time those started to crystallize. And I was moving through a Black revolutionary nationalism kind of organizing space. And now we're here in 2022, just about a decade later. But I think that the spike in anti-trans legislation, anti-trans sentiment at the social and cultural level is a response to the years of the Black Lives Matter era, so to speak. We have to think about the fact that we had a fiery nationwide and global uprising against settler colonial property on this soil in the summer of 2020 in the wake of the deaths of Breonna Taylor and of George Floyd. May they both rest in peace. And this was in the midst of a pandemic that is still ravaging our lives to this day. So many lives are being lost, and people rose up. Black people led a rebellion, and many other people followed behind us in support. And so I think what's happening now is that folks who always had a fear of losing hold to the property that was lit on fire, losing hold to the power, the necro power specifically of the police, they're like, enough is enough in terms of any kind of progressivism, whether it's along racial lines, gender lines, et cetera, but they're gonna put the gender contradiction at the forefront because they understand that their class interests and the class interests of people outside of the white settler populace will unite around patriarchy, will unite around cis heterosexism, because if we understand Marxism and I come from a Marxist perspective, patriarchy, the nuclear family, these things are connected to the property system. And again, it was the property system that was under threat during the uprisings. People were setting fire to stores and looting and stuff. So I think that there's a connection between Black radical tradition and trans liberation that is being undermined in this moment.
I think that's a really profound connection you're making between sort of the backlash from that liberatory moment from the uprisings in 2020 and this, as you're describing, sort of consolidation around property and the family, patriarchy. And I'm hearing in all of your sort of responses the ways in which things are really difficult for trans people generally right now, but also that breaks down along lines of citizenship, race. And so I wonder if we could just dwell with that a little bit longer. What are the sort of specificities of this moment in regards to how the, maybe it's the legislation that you want to speak to, Nikki, or other sort of just political trends, developments that are linking this kind of backlash against trans people to larger racist histories within the United States.
I've been feeling, lately that is like our identity has been appropriated by both political parties in a way that is not in our best benefit or is like really meaningful to trans people, but it's just some kind of weapon to fire against each other in terms of parties, right? And like, I don't really think like Democrats give a shit about us either, right? I don't think they are as evil as Republicans. You know, I could take a Democrat at any time. Republicans only clients. I take it. When they come from Texas and they're gonna have some freaky sex, that's the only time that I can share space with the Republicans. But I believe that we are a tool, we are a weapon that they use, and it's like always this incredible uncertainty of like what is going to be of my life depending on who wins the election, right? And how is my identity going to be weaponized to fuel hate, right, from others? And the reality is like, I don't bother anybody. I really don't. Like, my existence is totally peaceful. I cannot understand how anybody could see me or any of the trans people that I know as a threat to society, right? But that's how we are, that's how we are portrayed in a form of like weaponizing us as we are like some kind of menace to the life of others, right? So I am not sure if again, I hate to be so pessimistic because I really try to be optimistic, but I don't even know if any of the two political parties in this country really care for me in all my identities as a trans person, as an immigrant, as a sex worker. I'm not sure if anybody really cares of what they're really doing is just using my identity as a weapon to just witness it. Does that make sense?
I see a lot of thoughts in response to that.
Okay, so there's a couple of things you said that I actually was like, oh, I do actually respond to it. One, again, thank you for sharing. I actually think that we are a menace, and I think that we actually are dangerous to society. I think gender variance threatens the cis heteronormative like foundation of the settler colonialism in the United States, right? Like, we do problematize very much the like sort of like fascist political program that is America, right? I mean, like, America gave to the world eugenics and manifest destiny and like fascism, right? Like, there is these deep historical lines that they're still being manifested. Their shapes have changed, but the core political project of the United States, Republicans, Democrats, etc., remains the same. And I think that the very existence of queer and particularly trans people is frightening, because we do just by our mere presence, by observing us, offer an alternative that is deeply terrifying to the narratives that are so crucial to Christian fascism, white settler colonialism. I think we have a wide range of terms for this political project, but we do. I mean, I think we are a menace. I think we're threatening. I think that's a tremendous amount of power. I think that we are absolutely being used. I think that there's no real question that our identities are being used by both political parties to advance their specific political gains or their projects, neither of which are good for us, right? Like, democratic neoliberalism is also going to result in the death of all of us through neglect, the like open hostility and the forceful detransitioning that we're seeing in southern states, you know, those are two sides of the same form of like and continuing traditions of oppression. But I do think that there is a way to celebrate that difference, celebrate being a menace, celebrate being a threat, leaning into that. I think there's something that I find incredibly powerful, that our mere presence, our mere visage terrify someone like, I don't know, Matt Walsh, right? Or like a self-proclaimed theocratic fascist, right? Is so deeply, his worldview is so deeply compromised by our mere existence that it shows, I think, a fragility that is unacceptable to the fascist project, which only worships a sort of a form of like strength and political violence. So cool, awesome. I love it. I love it. And I think, yeah, I want to make sure that I have a tendency to overspeak, so I want to make sure.
For me, I get caught between the idea of like I'm not a threat and then I am. Like there's some days where I'm like fuck the system, you know, fuck 12, fuck all that, and then there's other days where I'm like I just want to be left alone. Like on my way here, people giving me stares and stuff, and I'm like, can y'all just like get out of our business? Like we are everywhere. People are always talking about gender identity agendas and gay agendas and this, that, and the third. It gets annoying, like mind your business. But then there are days where I'm like, actually, yeah, we are that. The fuck is we talking about? Like my ancestors were shamans and priests and all of these spiritual leaders back in Africa and a lot of indigenous cultures. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like we led uprisings and stuff, whether it be Stonewall, Compton Cafeteria riots, like we out here. And so I feel like what helps me balance those two sentiments is to understand that there's a complexity, there's a multiplicity when it comes to queerness and transness, not just in terms of our identities, which are a vast set of spectrums and umbrella terms, but also in terms of the social implications of our presence. And I think when I say that, I mean like the historical material basis for the various forms of gender diversity in many societies around the world are all tied up with the different ways that material and power relations were threaded, various kinds of roles, various nexuses that connected certain institutions, lifeways, et cetera, and capitalism and colonialism has to maintain a certain rigid set of relations, especially the nuclear family, which I mentioned before. And I think the man, so to speak, understands that some of us remember what was possible before, what could be possible outside of colonialism and capitalism, because our people have fought and have continued to fight, and trans people more broadly have been part of that fight again and again and again and again. And what's happening now, in my view, is that we've had a couple of decades where that fight was being co-opted, like you were saying, you know, like them giving this sort of representation politics to us, whether it's along racial lines or gender, sexual lines of disability. Tanyika Shakur, rest in peace, he calls this the problem of action, reaction, solution. So the people who created the problem, the people who spread the buggery laws to the third world and all around the world, the people who entrenched homophobia and everything around the world. Now they're pretending to be on the top of civil rights and gender sexual rights and racial justice, et cetera, et cetera. So it becomes this rock in a hard place, a catch-22. Like one side is the conservative foxes that want to eat us, get rid of us, and then you have, conservative wolves, and then you have the foxes who smile, aka Democrats, and they're like, oh, but we're giving you rights, but both of those are forms of like control, dominance that they're maintaining. It's ways of what I like to think of as patriarchal expansionism, and then it restricts in the same way that, like, you know, there are times where white supremacy will exclude certain white ethnicities, European ethnicities, and then other days it will include them. I think that a similar logic happens when it comes to gender and sexuality. There are moments where it's convenient to be expansive, convenient to be restrictive, and that's why the representation looks a certain way. It's always benefiting certain people, especially white cis gays. And it's so easily snatched away from us when it's time to protect those material interests.
thank you. Yeah, so much, and all of those comments. And, you know, we have this idea of sort of an intergenerational panel, but we're also, I think, reaching across so many different scales of history right now. Like, seeing like this really deep history of the time, you know, before the United States was the power that it is, the more recent history where it has secured that sort of dominance through different tactics that you've all described, and the present, you know, where we see, I love this image of the foxes and the wolves and their
Yeah.
different tactics.
Shout out to Malcolm X for that.
Calling into the room, thank you. And I guess I'm thinking that maybe we can shift a little bit. And this might still be a part of the conversation tinged with pessimism, but maybe we can try to salvage a little bit of the optimism that you're reaching for, Cecilia, and thinking about if, you know, electoral politics are not seemingly presenting any roads out of the situation. And so I think you were saying that the law can be a tool, but it's not really a liberatory path. What are some of the ways we can use those tools? What are tactics of engagement or disengagement with the political or legal system? And then what are other ways forward for trans liberation?
I guess it's like, you can translate it to my history of sex work, right? I have this narrative of like fuck everything because that's what I believe, and I also like try to work with people because otherwise, getting nothing or getting a little bit of something, sometimes I prefer to get a little bit of something. So, that still doesn't mean that I don't really think that fuck everything is the answer, right? But if I have to just have a meeting with an elected to try to get like a piece of legislation that is going to help the community or a new fund, I do it. But I think maybe because I'm just pissed off at this fucking shit that happened and with the immigration office, that they deny my citizenship. Is that because I think I'm really pissed off about that, and I just can't let it go, and that's why I'm so pessimistic though. But also, like, I think it's important to add that this narrative that is anti-trans comes a lot from feminist women, and comes a lot from queer feminist, and comes a lot from white queer feminists, right? The same narrative that fucking Ron DeSantis had is the same narrative that J.K. Rowling had. And it came from her to me because he was not there yet, right? So I believe that understanding that a lot of feminists who may have a leftist approach to life have a terrible narrative that kind of fuel the sentiment of right-wing politics. And it's like really complicated to know somebody who kind of like has a narrative that is of liberation for all other communities, but when it comes to trans people, they're extremely right-wing. And it's just, I cannot understand it, and I've been trying to understand it, and there's no way to explain that. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, that the enemy is coming in multiple forms, right? Yeah, it's not just the Democrats and Republicans, the people who seem to
It's
transcend.
leftist too.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, there's so many people that I thought was comrades who are anti-trans and specifically trans misogynistic. Like, let's be real here, is that there's a general transphobia, and then there's a specific kind of trans misogyny that's going on right now, and it's leftist, it's feminist leading it.
Innocent blackness.
Yeah, exactly. Especially like being a Black trans woman, we have trans misogynoir, like that's a whole like extra thing. And I used to be so perplexed by it too. Like, what the hell? Like, we're supposed to be sisters in the struggle, et cetera, et cetera. We're all fighting patriarchy. We're all fighting all these things. And they say no, they say no, they say no. And one of the biggest voices of this feminist anti-transness is radical feminism. Radical feminism was radical because it agreed with mid-20th century scientific insights about how gender and sex wasn't the same. It's like, okay, good for y'all. Y'all were right there for agreeing with that. But then they were just like, okay, so well, sex is real and gender is made up, and sex is the basis of socialization and how one's treated. So technically, even if you are trans, you're actually still assigned sex. Like, this is like where their mentality is a lot of the time. And it's really sad, like how, especially when I think about the mid-20th century, like there were these advances in science because there were advances in general society happening at that time. Civil rights movement, decolonization movement, socialist struggles around the world, like those had an impact on the sciences. And it's like, why didn't radical feminism and other feminisms just stay true to those advances? Like they kind of just went back. But then I think about how all the struggles kind of went back eventually, got co-opted. And so I think this contradiction in feminism just has to do with the fact that like people have derived a benefit in not going to that liberatory extent that they were once working for a couple of decades ago, you know, because they've been bought out, you know, different kinds of gender studies have been brought out, you know, different organizations have been brought out, you know, neocolonialism has taken over anti-colonial struggles, and then we could talk about state socialism becoming state capitalism and all these different things. So I think there's just a bunch of co-option that happened, and instead of people just pushing themselves further, like what was happening, because I mean, last century's organizing was really immense. You know, like the trans liberation movement became visible because of that era, the 60s and 70s. That's great, but people didn't want to keep pushing it because they don't have to. They get in speakers, you know. J.K. Rowling, she's making bank off of her books. She's trying to hold on to that, you know. Same thing with Letitia Kai, the artist, and Dave Chappelle, and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Like, all these people are making money. The politicians in Nigeria and Ghana, they're neo-colonial dictators and puppets and everything like that. They know that they can garner elections by whipping up controversies around the gay agenda. And same thing here. People feel threatened, and so they know they can step up performance opportunities and, you know, also extra political campaigns on the same shit.
Absolutely, and that does a lot to maybe clarify the range of enemies that are facing trans people, right? Specifically, Black trans women and those who are, you know, seen as a particularly menacing menace to the United States project. But then if we're sort of identifying those enemies, how do we also identify our sources of power? And how do we maybe reach to, you know, so when I look back at the kind of histories of 20th century organizing that are most inspiring to me, it was like those movements of solidarity, creating solidarity across international borders, across different social groups, different political movements. Is there anything sort of like that you see at play, or potentials for that you see at play in the present?
Yeah, it's okay. So there is, yes, are the people who are opposed to our existence and want to enact eliminationist policies are varied and vast, but they're also pretty identifiable, right? I mean, like it is like, yes, radical feminists, TERFs, right? Gender criticals, like openly have been organizing with theocratic fascists, right? I mean, and have been doing so for, I think at this point, at least close to a decade, right? Like those, and have really abandoned any any of their other projects, right? I mean, we see people who identify as radical feminists working with Matt Walsh. I mean, I keep name dropping him because he's a terrible person, but he's also really good, like, yeah, that guy, right? That guy can just represent like kind of everything that we're talking about. Is it the worst of the worst? I mean, is there a difference between DeSantis and Matt Walsh? No, right? They're part of the same political project. So we do see these like radical feminists abandoning anything other than directly working to support that agenda. I will say that the theocratic fascist political project in the United States this year was tremendously successful. And I am going to get to the positive part. This is the part that I'm most excited about. I just want to lay the framework if you'll let me kind of like wax for a little bit. Okay, so, and I know I'm a lawyer, so I'm like framing everything as a lot. It's like, ooh, right? But like, and I apologize in advance. So Dobbs, right, which is the Supreme Court decision that overruled Roe v. Wade, right, did so much more than that. And I think that I always refer to it as like the mask off moment, right? Like that's really when this pretense act, we are an impartial body of jurists who like mull over the complexities of the law and arrive at a decision. That's always a fiction, right? That's always been a fiction. The Supreme Court and the legal system in general has always relied on a certain sense of legitimacy within the wider population. Any marginalized person knows like, fuck the law, right? Because we are the ones who are at it, you know, hit the knife point of it. But for wider society, like that legitimacy was important. So what Dobbs did was one, the Supreme Court was like, yes, we have been captured. We are a captured institution. I mean, it has always been a fascist institution, but it has been a restrained fascist institution, largely speaking. I call this the mask off moment because this is when it was like the very rules that we have for like the last 50, 60 years played by, that if you come to us, if you make smart legal arguments, if you play the system, we will like listen to you, gone. And not only does it imperil the right to abortion, right? And I'm sure many folks have also heard about like, well, now queer intimacy, queer marriage, you know, these are these spaces that have now become vulnerable where we thought we had maybe secured some sort of place in the system where those were perhaps protected, or at least somewhat protected. So that's gone. And they also made it very clear that they, not only the sense of legitimacy, but also the basic legal reasoning, like they made these areas more vulnerable. And where I get excited, because I know this has just been like real bummers all around, right, is we can look to what are folks doing in abortion spaces, right, to protect abortion, to protect people who are having abortions, to protect people who deliver abortions or perform them. We can look to anti-fascist organizing. There's a solidarity because our enemies are the same. It's the same political project. Its shape changes slightly to conform to modern times, but it is the same project. It's the same people. And so I think that there's a real value in looking at those tactics, right? Like, I think, you know, abortion funds, fantastic, but it's also like, are we funding trans people, right? Like funds to get people across state lines to get abortions, great. Are we creating pipelines for trans people to escape really terrifying situations in the Southern United States and in like red states, which are truly terrifying. I mean, I've worked with folks in there and I am deeply, acutely aware of what it means to be a queer person in New York City as opposed to in the South, and then particularly to be in the South and a person of color and trans, it's like, you know, it's very different. So I think that there is opportunities to be organizing along those same lines, but also we know that the strategies that the beast, the man, you know, the system are going to apply and have been applying to us are also being applied in other areas. And we can look to, you know, how do we do community defense? Or even if you look at like anti-fascist organizing, like are we doing defense committees for trans people who are being incarcerated? Are we doing, we can borrow those survival strategies because those communities or those populations are being attacked by the same people in the same way that we are. And so I think that that is helpful in terms of building solidarity, but also showing sort of like what works, right? Like what survival strategies have worked. And I think there are folks out there doing really tremendous work and, you know, that like we can look to. I also would be super remiss to also not point out that like, queer and trans people have always survived. We have survived for we have survived incredible neglect and direct oppression, like two axes of state power. So I think that there's a real tremendous, for me at least, the only place that I draw hope is like they haven't been able to kill us yet, right? I mean, they've killed some of us, and they're going to continue to kill some of us, but they have not succeeded. Yeah.
I think in terms of sources of inspiration for me, I always look at the history of Black anti-colonial struggle, Black nationalist struggle specifically, and I speak of nationalism in particular because how I understand it is that you have ethnic groups and cultural groups who have been subordinated by like a colonizer, capitalist powers, and are struggling for some kind of cultural independence and then also territorial and political sovereignty. And this history of struggle was very complicated throughout our history. A lot of it tended to be more religio-political in nature, especially during the days of like resistance on the continent and then anti-slavery uprisings, forms of Mouvement. When we get to like the Haitian Revolution, for example, and many of the rebellions that happened throughout the New World, the same thing. The 20th century, I think we start to see these forms of resistance move in a more civil rights focused direction and then a communistic direction. And I think that because pride came from gay power, right? And gay power happened during that era. Being consciously attentive to the development of anti-colonial struggle is important to contextualizing transliberation. And I think for folks who are not Black, operating in solidarity with that in mind is essential in this season. So some of the examples that come to mind, throughout the Black Lives Matter age, whenever I saw people leading and protests and vigils for Black, trans, and other trans and queer folks who have been taken by the state and, you know, by transphobes, homophobes, et cetera, there are always these altars, you know, community altars, ways of honoring the girls, especially who have been taken from us. And so I would see that in the light of like, okay, yeah, before the Haitian Revolution, there was a Badoon ceremony, you know, the spirituality aspect, you know, and these things have shown up in various other ways in trans histories around the world, a certain connection to spirituality. So I want to draw strength from that, draw optimism from that. And then I think about the civil rights space of struggle here in the US, Jim Crow, as it was called. Really domestic fascism, right? And, you know, these kinds of technologies of repression were being used all around the world by capitalism, colonialism, etc. And in the civil rights movement, we had different approaches to it. Some were more radical, some were less radical. And I think for trans struggles to become more conscious about those differences, but also where they can overlap both here and outside the US. And these are conversations that are already happening, but I think being more focused about them and connecting them to a larger history of anti-colonial struggle is important. And why that's important for me is because then when we get to the communist phase, this question of class, question of the state, that's really what is the most decisive in this moment. We have a climate crisis, like people are trying to find ways to maintain the dominant economic system. And so at some point, transliberation struggles are going to have to confront that. And we have confronted that before, we will continue to have to confront that. But coordinating across national lines with a really conscious decolonization imperative in mind, I think is important. I see that happening. I feel like just us doing that more and gathering around that more and building strategies around that more is essential.
Absolutely, a very expansive vision, right, of what transliberation means and what it links up to. I think it's important, as you were saying, Nikki, right, to think across state lines as well as then also thinking across national lines, that the
Right,
situation.
because even in the north, there's the quote unquote south, you know, there's like small towns in the north. It's the same kind of situation. You know, there's cores and peripheries throughout. So it's kind of,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, we're in the core of the core, so how can we organize here to help each other, but also think about how that organizes with each others, right? I think it's really important.
In the I found some optimism. You know, I really think of like, you know, when I think about like, I think about like, you know, mutual aid and what happened throughout the pandemic and how queer people and specifically trans people find ways to help each other, to mutual aid. And I think we have something very interesting to explore here on how to translate a system of like economic support or financial support to other forms of support. I think it would be a really interesting take. And I also love the idea of people, many folks, many trans folks, queer folks are doing of just like buying big pieces of land and like cultivating it and living separated from the world. I think that's something that I think is something that could become a tool of liberation.
So we'll open to the audience and I'll give you all some time to maybe think of some questions. There's been a lot of different sort of specific and really general histories that have been laid out. And so if there's anything that you want our speakers to expand on or anything that you want to also offer yourselves, please feel free to do so. But before we do that, I also just wanted to open it up again to you all, and if there's anything that I didn't ask that you really want to speak on, but also if there's anything you want to ask each other, if there's something that you want to bring in to each other that hasn't been brought up yet. Since all right, well, I'll open it to the audience then. If there's anything.
If you could, we have 11 folks online. If anyone has a question online, they can chat it in and
Okay.
we can just read it from the computer.
Okay, great.
So you can invite them.
Sure, yeah, those online as well. Please, can you see the chat from where you are? Doctor?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Feel free to pop a question or comment or any sort of offering, and we can read it aloud here and also respond to it live. Michelle, please.
I was interested Nsambu.
It's Nsambu, that's right, remember. You can call me Blessing, that's the translation.
Blessings. You were talking about the family being like a political coalition or seduction, kind of it being used to bridge people into the settler colonial project. I was really interested in hearing a little bit more about that, kind of how transphobia and the family kind of function to enlist people into.
Yeah, that's a particular framing that I've been insisting on, especially within the last 2 years, based off of what I noticed, particularly during the rebellion. There would be times where I would come back from like vigils and stuff with comrades, and then there would be cisgender people who were Black, and you know, all Black people were rising up, you know, against the cops, and there are folks who are like pushing us as trans folk, like my comrades and I, out of this Black resistance along lines of insisting on cis hetero patriarchy, even to the point of blaming police brutality on transness, on queerness, like saying like God is punishing us with the police because of you all. And to like that strikes me as a sort of development on sexual narratives that were already being directed at the Black community in terms of like Moynihan's report, for example. So he's saying that like Black people are poor, dealing with police brutality, et cetera, because your community is matriarchal, which is of course not true, but it was a certain type of sexual narrative due to the fact that the nuclear family cis heteronormativity legitimately especially in terms of property relations in the state, it grounds, it's the core economic unit in bourgeois society. And Black people, of course, haven't been able to fit in bourgeois society in certain ways. And so you had these white supremacists using narratives that scandalize how we related to cis heteronormativity as Black people in a whole to explain why we were pushed out in these economic political ways. I think that there's been an evolution of that same kind of tactic, but putting specifically trans and queer forms of variance from cis heteronormativity at the fore. And those are things that I was confronting, and I've currently been spending a lot of time theorizing about why that's not just successful when whiteness is directing things at Black trans people, but also why internal to our community and within other colonized communities, this happens. And one of the theoretical terms that I draw on here when talking about this is Sanyika Shakur. He wrote The Pathology of Patriarchy, one of my favorite texts, and he theorizes a grand patriarchy, which is associated with the colonizers, but there's a minor patriarchy that emerged within colonized settings that's used by colonized people to try to get on par with the colonizers, you know, especially in terms of capitalism, because it's the way to ground that economic system. And so you have us as trans and queer people, especially colonizing ones, being hit by like both minor patriarchy and grand patriarchy. And I think that like in this particular moment, what we're watching is that being used to specifically unite a coalition across racial lines around anti-trans.
Wow. Yeah, I feel like maybe that was it minor patriarchy also is helpful for thinking about the radical feminists and others, right? Who get kind of swept into these larger into the grand patriarchy.
I think when it comes to radical feminism, since radical feminism typically comes out of white feminism, it would probably warrant its own term, you know, not necessarily
The minor
minor
specific to
patriarchy.
colonizers.
Yeah. And so I've been thinking of like speaking of radical feminism and those sorts of things as a sort of like complementarism, like that's specifically referring to a Christian doctrine, which moves away from patriarchy-ish by saying that like, oh, women aren't underneath men, women should be on the same, like equally yoked because the rib is the side, not the bottom. Like this, I grew up Christian. Like there's these like batshit Christian ideologies. And no offense to people who are Christian, but I'm just saying like there's this ideology of complementarism where it's like the sexes are supposed to be a complement to each other. And I think that if we're seeing radical feminists actually collaborate with these religious writers, we should probably start to speak of the radfems as a secular kind of complementarism. And so that's happening within grand patriarchy of the colonizer, and it's also happening within patriarchy, but it's a different kind of phenomenon.
Any other questions, comments, offerings? We'd love to have what you all
My name is Zayton, trans-Palestinian states for around 14 years now. I think it's like a comment and a question, I guess. So the first, the comment is about, we were talking about the focus of the world, and like how the Democrats have been using it trans for the agenda. In Palestine, we call that pinkwashing, right? Because it's that using trans queer people literally as a way to wage a war, in that case against Palestinians, in the case of Democrats against the working class, the unhomed, the nature itself. The question is, we talked a little bit on solidarity, intersectionality, and how that could be a source of power because we have a common enemy that is kind of targeting different marginalized community, but the issue is that creating solidarity
intersectionality is labor, and it's labor that is often made invisible, and that is almost never centered in the number it's mystified. And then the people who, so how do we like recognize that labor? How do we compensate it? And how do we like create the material needs for the people working that labor?
Thank you. I'm just gonna sort of repeat it for those who are online, if that's okay. Let me know if I misrepresent. But first, we had a comment that was comparing kind of our image of the foxes and the wolves from Malcolm X and as conveyed by Blessing, to represent the Democrats and Republicans and their sort of use of trans and queer people as this tool. Thinking about that along the same lines as what's called pinkwashing in the Israeli context of using queer and trans people in Israel, their presence as a kind of excuse or tool to continue to wage war on Palestinians. And so that was sort of the prelude to the question about solidarity and how the creation of solidarity is real work, it's labor, and that labor can be mystified, but it can go unrewarded, and that there needs to be ways of thinking about how to create the conditions such that people can engender solidarity and do that work, that labor of organizing. How can we meet people's material conditions such that they can actually do the labor of creating those connections outside of just all the other shit we have to do to make a living. So does that sound about right? All right, excellent. So yeah, if you all want, I know that you all have all done organizing in various ways, and what are the ways in which you've made that possible, and how can we make that possible for more people moving forward in the future?
I don't have an answer. I just want to say I think this pause is that's a phenomenal question. And I just want to acknowledge like the pause. I think, not to speak for everyone here, but I think we're all just, it's such a good question. We're all like, how do I answer that?
Sorry.
No, yeah, because I'm thinking about it, and it's like it's a really complicated question. So I am trying to answer.
Yeah, I don't wanna answer something that I'm not sure what I'm saying. So I really think that maybe we can meet in a week or something.
So I'm going to buy time for much better answers by just talking a little bit. So I think a few things that have come up that I think occur and continue to occur, but I want to highlight or kind of like uplift is meeting people's material needs, right? And one of the things that I kind of come in here prepared to talk about, but thankfully everyone here is like super on the ball and like really great, is like I was about the insufficiency of the legal system, right? And there was a very specific thing I think which does not at all address your question, and I apologize. But in terms of supporting folks who are moving through the legal system, both through the carceral system, but also like in these defensive legal like maneuvers to restrain the state, is a notion that the legal system doesn't meet our material needs. I will say personally, when I'm doing these lawsuits, the thing that is most apparent to me is that we cannot meet our clients' material needs. And so we ultimately always end up, not always, but there is a reason why most people who are like clients in impact litigation are wealthier, whiter, etc., is because they have the means to go without care, to endure the hardship of that legal process. And so it then means that what we're doing as a legal field is uplifting the most privileged of our community. And so I think, again, I'm literally just trying to buy time for what is definitely going to be better answers than mine, is thinking about how do we support folks moving through that system, both again carcerally and through like impact litigation. How do we meet their material needs? And I will say again, because I'm like, I'm not saying like we should abandon the legal field entirely, but I do think that we need to recognize like that there is a demand placed on folks who move through that. And I think thinking of it as like an adversarial system, which again, I think this firm does, but of like, how do we support each other moving through these adversarial systems? I have no idea how we support or center that like solidarity across different marginalized identities in a material and real way. Other than to be like, you are absolutely right that it is often mystified, rendered invisible. It's almost always the folks who are, the burden is being placed on the most marginalized identities, right? It's like the folks who are trying to build solidarity across marginalized identities are not white people for the most part, right? Like I think it's fair that there's an assumption that for white radicals that they are going to be brought in as opposed to be like, I think being said, I mean, I don't know, kind of like, there are white radicals who are great, right? But like, I do think that there is, that work is always being placed on the most marginalized to build those lines of solidarity, right? Which is like, and I don't know how to fix that, which is why I think your question is phenomenal. Because I think that answering that question or proposing for that, like how to resolve that question is, I think, something that will tremendously like help us to meet this moment of overwhelming state assault on our community.
I think when it comes to solidarity, a lot of times it's kind of thought of as this affective question of, you know, this sense of feeling or of kinship and connection. And I think that that's a real dimension of solidarity, but like, it's not even about materially creating solidarity. Like, so solidarity is material, ultimately. Even if we want to think about the white Western world and these imperial powers that engage in like the scramble for Africa and all these different things, like they had a united material interest, but they were also warring against each other. And, you know, a couple of, not just under 2-3 decades later, they were literally out there. World War I, World War II, etc. All of these different things, right? These imperialist warfare, forms of warfare. And yet there was a unity. And according to like my thesis that I was saying earlier here, we're seeing like a cross-national, cross-racial unity around cis hetero patriarchy. But even in that case, you know, like transphobes in the white world and the transphobes outside the Western world are not all united with each other in this sense of like we are one people, et cetera, et cetera. Like they're still competing with each other, you know, like even if there's an overlap between the white manosphere and then manospheres among men of color, there's still tension between the two. And yet they're still united around a certain kind of material project. And so I think if we're noticing that can happen in a reactionary sense, I definitely think that there is a possibility for it happening in the opposite direction, the revolutionary sense, where people are, you know, building from within their own communities, their own material interests, et cetera, and connecting those struggles with each other, specifically through the lens of like, we're fighting colonialism, we're fighting white supremacy, and we're uniting around gender and sexual liberation, because I think that that's the source of from the white supremacist side right now. And that's gonna take a long time. To actually build that is going to take a long time, I feel. I think it's gonna take the remainder of the 21st century. I think that the seeds for building that have been being laid, particularly within the last 2 decades, by the forms of militant activity rising now. So I believe we're on the precipice of being able to find concrete answers to that question in a way that we didn't have before. And it's going to take being conscious about noticing what is the quote unquote enemy doing and how can we like effectively respond to it. You know, and part of that will be theory, coming up with new theory. I think we keep relying on a lot of old theory from the 20th century, and I love what was given to us in that moment. I love Star, I love Marsha, I love Sylvia, but we need new stars. You know, we need new Marshas, we need new Sylvias, we need more people to actually sit down and build out these frameworks and these ideas, et cetera, in a way that's attuned to what's happening now in this time period.
Thank you. Okay, we have someone way back. Yeah, please.
Yeah, despite the flaws of the legal system, I'm thinking of a speaker who was denied citizenship. I'm assuming you're not the only one. Is there a way of inspiring and or shaming more lawyers to work pro bono on behalf of these individuals?
Real quick, I'm just going to repeat that for the virtual audience. Question about how to inspire or shame, which I love, lawyers into working pro bono, specifically around citizenship, immigration cases as they intersect with trans issues and trans people.
I support many organizations, for example, in Arizona, Mariposas Sin Fronteras, or in Arizona, Mariposas Sin Fronteras, Colectivo Cultural Transviviendo here in Queens, or Alianza Translatina, or Translatina Coalition in California, and that continues to be the question that is never answered: how we get legal services in terms of immigration to queer and trans people. I don't know. I've been trying in all kinds of ways because these folks are coming here like in fear for their lives, like I did in my time, and they encounter only more barriers that are the same kind of violence translated to another country. So yeah, I've been trying. I don't know how to. I wish I could do that. I have no problem shaming people, but I don't know. Nothing works from my end. I don't know. Do you have any?
Yeah, so there are a lot of legally trained folks who are radical, who are progressive, who want to do good work. Hopefully I count myself among those, right? The legal field itself is very much small c conservative. It is very, very much tied into like a technocratic understanding of the world. I mean, I could also spend 9 hours talking about how law school churns out like amoral people, like obsessed with the mechanistic love of the law and have literally had their moral compass ripped out. I mean, it's somewhat hyperbolic, but I think actually quite accurate. But it's also, the legal field is also funded through with the same priorities as general society, right? Like there is a reason why an attorney for a large corporation makes so much more money and is so much more well-resourced than a public interest lawyer or a public, or PD, right? Which is just a reflection of the same priorities of the ruling hegemonic power. I think that there's also I work with co-counsel who are like from white shoe law firms, like I work with those folks, right? I think that there's a very real consideration to be had of, do you want that person to assist you, right? Like, what does that attorney coming in with those specific beliefs and practices, or do you want an attorney who's going to come in and disregard everything that's important to you, who's going to shape the way that the case is run, who's going to present to you the options that you have to choose from, if they even do that, without any consideration of your own beliefs, your own values. I mean, there are, like, I think if you look at anti-fascist organizing, right, like there are movement lawyers who work, and I think they do a great job of aligning with the political values of political prisoners or people who are being incarcerated for political activities, right? You can very easily get a public defense attorney, a PD, who will make you cop that plea, who will try to separate you out from your comrades, right? Who will not create a unified legal strategy, because they are not comrades, they're not radical, they're not progressive. So yeah, I mean, and I pay rent on the entire concept of I'm doing harm reduction by engaging in a flawed system, right?
Yeah.
Like, and I think there's always a tension, but right, like I think you talked about like supporting organizations, but also understanding that there are limitations, right? Even in the nonprofit, I mean, we have the nonprofit industrial complex, right? We see, and I think, you know, we saw during 2020, like the uprising or like the rebellion, like we saw co-option by nonprofit industrial complex, by nonprofits, right? So I think that there is, the answer is, I think, I'm glad you asked that question. I think it's incredibly nuanced about where do we look to for resources and support, and that like, who's offering that resource, under what terms, what conditions, and the power relationship of that. Because I think the nonprofit industrial complex, I think many like legal, look, even in legal services, right? There is not a respect of autonomy of the person you're serving, right? It is a very hierarchical relationship, even though, you know, like your lawyer is your like, you're the boss of your lawyer or whatever, like that's not how those power relations play out. And so I think there's tremendous, I think that's something to be really, to interrogate and when engaging with. Sorry, yeah, hopefully that kind of answers. I mean, because also there are tons of incentives to do pro bono work, but I think for the reasons I've said, it's like, is that helpful? You know, like, is that what we want? Is that, yeah, is that reform? Is that like a, you know, I don't know.
Are there any questions from the folks online? Or for us, anybody else with comments or questions here? Close up ourselves up here. Well, I'll just end. I bet. Yeah. Well, I'll just end by you know, obviously I want to thank our panelists, but also just want to say, you know, for those in the audience, you know, this is something that Pinko is really hoping to continue to cultivate into the future. If you have like an idea for an event similar to this, or if you want to just have sort of an outlet to think about how do we build solidarity, how do we address these issues of meeting people's material needs, you know, we really would love to have that conversation with you. We'd also love to be a platform for these new theories that we need, right? New theorizing on what trans liberation means, what it entails, how does it build on past histories of resistance, but also how do we look towards creating new tactics, new forms of resistance. So reach out to us. I don't know what our email is. Okay, our email is commie@pinko.online. I never knew that. I love that. So yeah, please reach out to us. You know, if you want to write, or if you just have an idea for an event or want to be in touch, we really would just love to hear from people and have more opportunities to meet people and figure out how to address what obviously is a perilous situation. But please join me in thanking our panelists for their time and their insights.
Yeah.
Kiara, hopefully they'll be open a little bit longer if anybody wants to peruse and buy some books. Another brief plug for our editor Michelle's new book, Everything for Everyone, which is excellent for those thinking about creating utopic solutions to the conditions that we face. So I think that's
One thing real
of course,
quick.
yes, please.
I also encourage people to really support True Leap Press, TRUE, True Leap, LEAP Press. And the reason why is because they distribute reading materials, theoretical materials to folks behind bars. And that also includes my own writing that's geared to specifically at Black trans prisoners. And so they're trying to do a fundraiser right now in order to continue their work. And so I really encourage people to support them and to check them out and help them keep their work going so that radical theory can get to folks behind bars, especially Black trans folks. So.
Night, everyone. Thank you for joining us.